Hello everyone and welcome to this week's Top 5 Wednesday. The topic for this week is books that you feel differently about to how you felt about them when you first read them. So this is quite a tricky topic for me because I don't often reread books. If I reread a book, that means that I did really love it and want to read it all the time. And the reason for that is just because there are so many great books out there, and obviously I can't read every book in the world, but there are so many that I'm interested in. So if I finish a book, I will just move on to another one rather than reread it, even if I did really love it. There are only a few books in my whole reading history that I have read more than once. So I didn't have a huge range of options for the topic for this week, but I wanted to do it because it is an interesting topic and I did manage to cobble together 5 books to talk about with you. So the first one is Love Letters to the Dead by Ava Delara. When I first read this, and I have only read it once, I gave it either 4 or 5 stars, so I did absolutely love it. And over time, as I've kind of gone back to thinking about it, I first read it I think maybe 2 years ago now, I have kind of started to think that maybe it wasn't like as original as I first thought, because it is very Perks of Being a Wallflower-esque. The plot is very similar. The main character Laurel does remind me very much of a female version of Charlie from Perks of Being a Wallflower, and it has a lot of the same themes. So it has mental health, it has family member deaths, it has sexual abuse, it has trigger warnings for all of those things, as Perks does. And obviously Perks of Being a Wallflower, being one of my favourite books, I feel does it a lot better. There is original elements to this. If you guys don't know what this book is about, it's about 16-year-old Laurel who, for an English assignment at school, she is tasked with writing a letter to a dead celebrity, and she chooses Kurt Cobain. And then after the project is over, she continues to write letters, and it kind of helps her get over the death of her sister, which she is struggling to cope with. So she writes letters to celebrities who have died young, like her sister did. So she writes letters to Amy Winehouse, Heath Ledger, River Phoenix, Janis Joplin, Kurt Cobain, obviously, Jimi Hendrix. So there is that kind of unique letter element to it, but apart from that, it is very similar to Perks of Being a Wallflower. And I think when I first read it, because I love Perks of Being a Wallflower, I did just love it because it reminded me of that. So as I've kind of thought about it over time, I do feel slightly differently, and maybe if I'd read it with Perks of Being a Wallflower very fresh in my mind, I possibly would have scored it a little bit less than I did when I first read the book. But it is still a good book, and I would still recommend it. Certainly if you are a fan of Perks of Being a Wallflower, just be aware that this is not really an original concept or original story. So yeah. The next book that I feel differently about is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. The reason I feel differently about this, and I have reread this book, I've read this book 2 or 3 times I think, and it is quite big, so I do absolutely adore it. But the first time I read it, it was required reading for my English, my first year of my English degree. So I think with books that you are required to read for study, you kind of, because you're forced to read them, it does take some of the enjoyment out of it, because you are, being told by a teacher like what to look for, and you're given academic interpretations and things like that, rather than being able to read for pleasure and form your own opinions. I mean, obviously you can form your own opinions, but you are kind of distracted by your actual academic study of it. But as I've reread this, since I've left uni, it is actually one of my favourite books. I appreciate the fact that it's so ahead of its time. I fully relate to Jane, and I think the first time I read it as a student, I just couldn't really appreciate it for the Victorian masterpiece that it is. So yeah. The next book I feel differently about is Salem's Lot by Stephen King. This is Stephen King doing vampires, and when I first read it, I had not long ago finished Twilight, which you guys know I wasn't the biggest fan of, and I don't think it was the best time really for me to be picking up more vampire fiction. I didn't hate it, but it really isn't my favourite Stephen King book, but I would actually really like to reread it and kind of appreciate Stephen King doing vampires, because I do remember that he does his own take on it. It's not really like other vampire books that I have read. But I don't know, I think at the time I was just on a little kind of vampire vendetta, and I didn't really read it at the right time in my life. So I will hopefully be able to get a copy of it and reread it now that I am a little bit older, and now that I've read more Stephen King as well. I know what an amazing writer he is. From what I remember of this, the horror in it is very kind of subtle, so in some ways, you know, some people would argue that that is kind of slightly creepier than the very sort of like blatant graphic horror that a lot of horror writers and horror films have in them, and Stephen King is a master at doing that. So I would really like to reread it, even though it's not my favourite Stephen King story. There is a movie of it as well, which apparently is very scary, so maybe I will watch that before I reread it. So yeah. The next book that I feel differently about is a similar story to Jane Eyre as to the reasons why I feel differently about it, and that is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. You can't really see that, but it is a gorgeous, gorgeous cover. There you go. This is the Penguin English Library edition, and obviously there are loads and loads of editions that I could have picked to show you. I'm trying to get the best light on that, and there you go. If I just hold it still, there you go. And this is definitely my favourite. It's absolutely gorgeous. I can't believe I don't actually own a physical copy of this book. I swear like everybody in the world does own a physical copy of it, so I don't really know why I don't. But when I first read this, I was pretty young, and it was the first Jane Austen book I read. I think I was maybe 14, 15 when I first read this book. I didn't have to read it, but it was a book that obviously had been battered around like through English teachers and things like that, and I got curious and I picked it up, and I did kind of have to force myself to read it, because I think at that age I wasn't really kind of, my reading taste hadn't really developed enough for me to be able to enjoy Jane Austen as she should be enjoyed. I didn't appreciate the comedy, I didn't appreciate the historical time period or anything like that. So now that I have read a lot more Jane Austen and a lot more historical fiction set in that time, I think that I would enjoy it more. Obviously I've seen the film, but I haven't actually reread the book in ages. So I've seen actually quite a few adaptations of the film, and obviously I know the story. I have read Pride and Prejudice and Zombies and really enjoy that. So yeah, I do want to reread it. It is obviously a classic that everyone should read and that many, many people have. So hopefully I will get a copy of it and give it a reread. And the last book that I feel differently about, and I don't know if I do feel differently about, but when I first read it, I really wasn't the biggest fan, and that is House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. Yeah, that's his name, Mark Z. Danielewski. This is a book that most people, pretty much everyone actually, apart from me who's read it, raves about it. They're like, it's the biggest, you know, it messes your mind up so hugely. It's a unique read. It will stay with you. Everyone that's read it, if you mention it, they will remember that book and remember what it did to them. And when I read it, I was just really, really bored. I just couldn't get into it. It's written in quite an interesting format, like there's words all over the page. It is supposed to kind of get inside your head. To be honest with you, I can't even summarise the plot, and I don't know if I'm supposed to be able to summarise it or not, because it is that kind of conceptual book. But I just remember being so disappointed in it, because I'd heard these amazing things about it, and when I read it, I didn't enjoy it. And I don't know if I didn't read it at the right time in my life or something like that. But yeah, I'm not the biggest fan of it. Well, I wasn't, but I do feel differently because I want to reread it, and I want to sort of try and see if on a second read that I kind of see what everyone else sees in it. So yeah. And that is it for the books that I feel differently about. It was quite a hard choice for me, so it is an eclectic mix, and I did kind of struggle to put this list together, but as I said, I wanted to do it because it was an interesting topic, and hopefully you guys got some enjoyment out of it. On Friday, I will be posting the video and opening the giveaway for my US hardback of The Savage Song by Victoria Schwab, so if you are interested in winning that book, stay tuned for that video, which as I said will be posted on Friday. Obviously all my social media will be down below as normal. I hope you're having an awesome day, and I'll see you very soon for another video. Bye bye.